Thank you, Vero, for that really kind introduction. I don't know if I deserve it, but it is really lovely to be here, especially because this is not the normal time as I understand it for the colloquium, so I appreciate being flexible, and I understand people need to come and go, and that's fine too. So I'm going to talk today about my book, and there's a couple of copies circulating around. If you want to look at some of the images, there's a lot of cartoons and photos that kind of help illustrate some of the things I'm going to talk about today, which is what is the activist challenge in a place such as Myanmar. And so I use an ethnography of grassroots activists, about whom I'll speak much more in a moment, as a way to kind of, on one hand, maybe like vertically in one direction, to understand the form and structure of the particularly odd, but maybe not so odd, post-colonial state formation in a place like Myanmar, Burma. And then on the other hand, they provided me access to a pretty, maybe not exclusive, but a domain that during this transitional period in Myanmar from 2011 to 2021, the sort of grassroots arena that was being kind of elided by discourses of liberal progress. And so these activists who did not participate in that transition in the same way, but were still kind of wanting to work for it in one regard, were able to provide me a perspective on how normal people thought about things like rights. So I'm going to start by talking about the first part, the sort of particular structure of the state, and state in quotes is always in anthro because it's always more and less than that. Then look at activist life through ethnography that I did with them, and then look at the political idioms, focusing in on rights and talking a little bit about the way the linguistics, the particular ways that grammatically and semantically different people in Burma versus people in the West talk about rights, how that provides a sort of point of entry into deconstructing a term, rights that we, at least I, got pretty used to thinking as hegemonic, but through this project was able to kind of open up and see it as something more complex. Okay, so how did I come to Myanmar, and how did I come to this book? My own motivation to study the state and society relations in Myanmar went all the way back to 2004 when I first moved to the country, at which point I read many of the accounts of karaoke fascism or living in silence in the country. Those are titles of two relatively famous books on the country at the time. And so I expected big men with guns everywhere. And so going through immigration was quite terrifying. I didn't think anything bad would happen to me bodily, but I was concerned that I would get in trouble and I would get deported. But instead, I was only faced with disinterested or amused or bemused, at least, officials who helped coax me along with my broken Burmese at that point. And this was sort of emblematic for the whole year I spent there, where I often looked around trying to find this scary state, often wondering where exactly it was. But of course, this is a state that also could orchestrate a military coup, which ended that period of so-called transition that I described a few moments ago between 2011 and 2021. So on the 1st of February, after not liking the outcome of a free and fair election, they took back power. Now the Burmese people were not impressed by this, and they went out to the streets in their millions in kind of like moments of what we might call direct resistance and direct contestation. This gentleman on the left holds up a sign in Burmese that says, if a corpse is needed for R2P to enter, our responsibility to protect, come shoot me dead. So this is a pretty full-throated and full-throttle opposition to the state. Now, unfortunately, the regime was more than willing to oblige vis-a-vis corpses, which took the form of murdered children, burned villages, mutilated protesters, things that continue to this day that I don't need to recapitulate too much. And in the use of those bodies, on one hand, they presenced them on the street as a way of kind of magnifying the terror as a threat, saying this is what will happen to you. But on the other hand, they snatched bodies and disappeared them so families didn't know what was actually happening to their loved ones. So there's a sort of interesting terror of presence and terror of absence that mimicked what I was observing 10, 15 years earlier, 20 years earlier almost in 2004, when the state could be very present in some senses and very absent in others. At this point, the resistance or the rebellion or the uprising, revolution, lots of those terms I think would apply, rather than running straight into the guns that would annihilate them, pivoted towards a more diffuse refusal, I'll say, of the coup and its prescriptions. This was emblematized in this something called the boo campaign. So boo is the negating particle in Burmese. It could be translated as no. We see different versions of it here in stickers that are saying, if we say no, we will get a revolution. This person is saying, the father figure is saying the parable, and the mother and then daughter are rejecting it. So how exactly did this no come to manifest? So in one particularly tragic distillation, there was a group of revolutionaries jumped to their death holding hands off of a 11-story building rather than be arrested and potentially be interrogated and give up their comrades. And then a more diffuse rejection of the regime across society in the form of a sort of general strike in which all things connected to the military were denied. The head of UNICEF in Myanmar said that in her over 2 decades of work around the world, she had never seen people so willing to take on personal costs up to and including their own death, so denying going to the hospital where they would get cancer treatment, for instance, not getting COVID vaccines, to try to deny the regime from getting a latch on the country. So this was a no, but it was also a different kind of yes. And I want to then go into the proverb itself, because to get a yes out of this no is particularly interesting given the parable. So it's Gutalonzan Odown Masinye, which can be translated kind of into, if you carry no like a talisman against evil, you won't be poor even when you're old. But in this sense of denying everything, even the possibility of a sociality that would connect to other people and to make everyone stronger, it's considered to be pretty cynical, right? It kind of reminds us of Ardeth Thongmung's, whose book was actually at Wisconsin Press that came out a couple years ago on everyday coping strategies in Myanmar, in which she describes negative coping strategies, where people get stuck in these suboptimal equilibria, unwilling and unable and unresourced to trust their neighbors and their friends, and so things end up getting worse over time rather than better. So they took this cynical parable and re-signified it into connection with others. So this cartoon have people who have gone on strike now riding a trishaw to move people around, now providing watermelon, and the person on the left says, "Hey doctor," and the one on the left says, "Ha, teacher," showing that their other professions are usually somewhere else. Madira writes about this in the present tense, talking about this collective effervescence of this boo moment of both rejection and connection. So that's all well and good, and I think interesting in its own right, but I want to linger on the sort of palimpsesty quality of a resignification of the boo parable. In other words, resignifying it doesn't obliterate the referent. You keep that original meaning in mind at the same time, or at least I think the protesters are, or at least I did. Because I think the boo parable and its resignification distills the challenge of activism in a place like Myanmar. Because on one hand, you could create something new, but on the other hand, there's always that risk of falling back to that negation of people moving away from each other. And so activists have to struggle with a question of how to resist in contexts where they don't have any rights to secure their incursions. Especially, as indicated earlier, where direct resistance, head-on assault would lead to their own annihilation. But also where that sovereign is somewhat illegible, in the sense of parading or disappearing of bodies, of there being no men on the street with guns when I lived there in 2004. So even finding this thing to resist against is sometimes challenging. So that's one sort of issue. And if we use a schematic spatial metaphor, that might be the sort of vertical challenge, where you're trying to find the state and get it to stop doing things you don't want it to do, or to do things that you want it to do. But there's also a sort of horizontal challenge, which reminds us of the boo parable, where you have people who have been conditioned to see their conditions as, if not normal, then at least something that are very hard to resist or refuse. How to get them to see them differently as potential objects for politics, and then as a result to take different actions. So through these empirical ethnographic kind of observations, which I'll speak more about in a bit, I wanted to intervene and sort of classic resistance theory, which I think there's a reason why it's kind of become a little bit enervated in the field of anthropology, for instance. And people are looking for other idioms, such as refusal, which have become a lot more popular. And so on one hand, resistance tends to presume a stable, legible class who's being oppressed and hence who are always already, as it were, ready to come when they're called. So I think here of, and I hope this is not too patricidal given that he was one of my advisors, but James Scott talking about infrapolitics in chapter 8 of The Domination of Arts of Resistance, where the idea of the hidden transcript is that everyone understands it legibly and they're too smart to bring it up in public. But then when the conditions change, they're ready, they're already on the same page and ready to rise up. Sort of this sort of spontaneous politics that sometimes can be observed. And I don't want to deny that that's possible, but it's not something that we necessarily see in Burma. And a presumption of it elides or obscures all the work that it takes to mobilize and organize people to do that. So on the other hand, and this was more surprising for me, resistance kind of presumes a stable, legible object to protest against. But I want to try to convince you that Myanmar's is not this kind of state. So Myanmar's is a kind of state that has this, what I've alluded to, radical presence and absence. So the presence is pretty obvious. This is what we know about an authoritarian state. It will, even during the liberalization period, proceed with sort of neoliberal reterritorialization, which is a wordy way of saying turning land into a commodity and stealing it from peasants and stripping them of the means of production to sell this new commodity on the market. It will exercise the sovereign exception up to and including the coup, and it will pursue racialized differentiation up to and including the genocide of the Rohingya. And so one of the chapters in the book, although not much in today's talk, tries to address the Rohingya, because you can't have a book on the period of 2011 and 2021 without dealing with this world historical event and what sort of political economic conditions enabled it. But this is also a state that is radically absent. So not just in the earlier examples, but this is the kind of thing I observed in the ethnography, whereas this is a state that will not respond to farmers' complaint letters. Its agents will tell protesters to finish up quickly so as to not make a scene. It will not rearrest a protester when she takes off her shirt and burns it in a court compound. So here, this is Ma San San, who had just been convicted that very moment, about 10 minutes before, and sentenced to 54 months in prison for conducting a peaceful protest outside the Chinese embassy. Again, during the supposed transition period when everything was supposed to be improving. And rather than submit to that final declaration, she took off her shirt that had on it written rule of law, and she burned it, and then she yelled, "Aung Bi, Aung Bi, Aung Bi," 3 times, which means victory has been achieved, which is a particularly weird thing to yell after you're going to be imprisoned for a peaceful protest. But an interesting thing as well, and I'll come back to it at the end, in the way that it pries open what seems to be an open-shut case and leave the sort of immediate or proximal defeat open for re-signification of potential victory. And I'll talk a little bit more of that at the end. But anyway, we're still talking about the state. So this is not just a state that is absent in the sense of its coercive apparatus, so the police and its army, which unfortunately is also all too present, but also the sort of governmental or biopolitical apparatus, in which this is the kind of state that would have administrative forms but not use them, has ethnic classifications but does not really know them. It has ID cards on which those ethnic classifications go, but it had a census only after 40 years of not doing it. And that census revealed that over 30% of the population doesn't even have these cards, which are supposed to be so central to their identification. But more importantly, what's on these ID cards includes their lumyo, their race. But if you ask people, "Ba lumyole, what race are you?" they'll often give you an answer that doesn't confer or conform to the categories that are in the census. You could ask a person what lumyo you are, and they'll say, "I'm Buddhist lumyo," which, as an anthropologist, we kind of think that's interesting. You're a Buddhist race, and are totally fine with it. But the point I'm trying to illustrate is that if this was a kind of state that could exercise the infrastructural power to monopolize and exhaust the categorization project itself, in other words, have a scriptive power to say, you have to be one of these 135 categories, then the idea, a Buddhist lumyo would be difficult to enact. So in other words, in some ways, the governmental state power is so weak that the categorization projects that people are arranging for themselves have been given over to the people themselves. Finally, it will give over certain localized state functions to right-wing political organizations, such as the infamous Mabata, who's trying to police inter-ethnic marriages and interreligious marriages. Okay, so provisionally, putting these together, this is the kind of state that can conduct genocide, organize a coup, some of the most definitive sovereign acts imaginable, but it also is one that kind of will disappear from grasp. It's a kind of slippery sovereign. And this means, I argue, that it requires a particular kind of engagement. So there's an interesting mimesis that goes on between the state form and the activists who are resisting it, where the state and the activists both oscillate between presence and absence. So activists must never be completely absent. They cannot turn away so far. They can't be so committed to the boo of rejection. Cannot be a turning away so far that it ceases to trouble that apparatus. And this kind of makes me think of sort of slightly liberal pieties of, well, I resisted in my heart. But if you are not showing anyone that you're actually resisting, you're left with a state that's quite happy to have you resist in your heart, so to speak, while it gets to continue to do bad things. So on one hand, they cannot be completely absent in terms of that subjective quietude or the kind of giving up of actual space, fleeing so far away that you can no longer trouble that which you're fleeing. But on the other hand, it can't assert presence, the activists, because that would prove suicidal against the excessive sovereign force and power. So there's an interesting sort of cat and mouse game that emerges here. And this is where I try to bring in refusal, which is a concept that has been theorized in indigenous studies, black studies, and their intersections in anthropology by people who are feeling discontented with classic resistance. Sorry, I don't want to get my R words mixed up. And want to bring in something else. So refusal recognizes the sort of inseparability of this apparatus of power and the groups that are trying to resist or maneuver it. So they're all kind of tied up in one thing. But those people who are hence tied up in it are subject to becoming resubjectivized or interpolated by it. So you can't assume that everyone is going to come when you call. You have to do a lot of work to mobilize. On the other hand, because flight is not a privilege to all, people are stuck in that situation and can't merely spatially refuse to the point of leaving altogether. So I argue this entails a necessary maneuver and negotiation of biopolitical inclusions and exclusions. So I already kind of talked about this a little bit, but I'm going to reiterate that it can't be so quiet that it fades away. It must be semiotic in the sense of creating a response. And so because the effective meaning of any political action for it to really be called political depends on the sort of response that it generates, the interpretance, to use a linguistic anthropological term, that is generated by what it does. Refusers' opacity, their turning away, can't be entire. Otherwise, there's a risk that this refusal becomes difficult to differentiate from pacification. And this is because, as I mentioned earlier, you're sending signs out that are more likely to be read as pacification than as resistance. So if I'm keeping resistance in my heart, so to speak, but only sending out signs of pacification, you, horizontally to me in this schematic metaphor, will say, well, no one else is resisting, maybe I shouldn't either. And so what it becomes, refusal becomes a very delicate calibration to what you can get away with, to continue to tell other people that there is a different way of doing things without getting crushed by doing it. Otherwise, there's a sort of risk of falling back into this earlier Boo parable of self-devourment in which everyone turns away from one another. So in this regard, I kind of argue for a resistance-refusal tactical dialectic, in the sense that resistance is that direct contestation in order to presence the state, get it to show up, provide a model for people to see an alternative articulated, but refusal is the navigation of the administrative state and its broader apparatus, the enduring, mobilizing, waiting, rehabilitating, planning, evading, etc., that happens in that shadow of direct contestation. So most of my year of spending time with these activists wasn't spent going to, protests where direct actions, but rather was all the other stuff that was around it, planning those things and then recovering from them, anticipating the way that provisional victories could be turned into failures if additional steps, preemptive steps, weren't taken. So what do I mean by mobilizing around a biopolitical apparatus? That's pretty jargony. Well, this is because I operate through Partha Chatterjee's idea that in the so-called post-colony, we need to get away from thinking about people as rights-bearing subjects, because that's not how they're regulated. Because of the way that the post-colony evolved from the colony that did not take individuals with rights and one person, one vote, but took population groups as you're this ethnicity or you're this this professional group. And as a result, all citizenship is founded in a sort of biopolitics of the population. So Chatterjee argues that this sort of politics operates through the exception, where population groups mobilize to try to get things that they want, not as rights, so to speak, but as exceptions. But I want to go like a slight step further and suggest that while subjects in Myanmar are certainly not rights bearers, it's also hard for them to substantiate themselves as population groups. They're not presupposed as such because of that weak administrative state that I described earlier. And as a result, it's very easy for their claims to be dismissed. And so a lot of the work that the activists do is they try to make these groups legible as population groups, to get their story straight, to bring the farmers back together, to constitute themselves as a group, to make to send a letter to the state as such, and then when that doesn't work, then escalate their actions up to and including direct actions where they reclaim their land, called plow protests, which is a huge part of the stuff that I ended up studying. And then the other side of biopolitics, the kind of like promoting life at the level of the population group, was a huge part of what the activists did. So whether it's supporting free funeral societies, organizing worker groups, dealing with daily life in the peripheral zones of Yangon, a lot of the work that they were doing wasn't contestation, but rather sort of supporting life in an absence of biopolitical support by the state. All right, so that was 20 minutes of telling you kind of like some of the theory and starting to introduce what the activists were doing. I want to pivot now to talk about, well, what are these activists actually doing, who are they, and where did they go, and what did they do? So between 2014 and 15, I spent a year working with a group whose more activist or direct contestation side was called MDCF, which is the Movement for Democracy Current Force. And when I met the leader of this, a man named Godol, who became kind of the central interlocutor in the book, I lingered on this term. I was trying to fit this group into the categories that I knew that existed in this brave new Burma. Are you an NGO, or are you a political party? And he looked at me and he dryly said, we are a force. And I laughed, and eventually he was kind enough to laugh too, but I think it illustrated something important about the particular structure of political possibility at that moment, in which everyone was being inducted into the sort of liberal reformist channels, and they were suspecting and knew ultimately that there was a lot more work to be done outside of that. So when I talk about activists in Burma, you may know people who call themselves activists too in Burma, or not. And that's perfectly fine. They can call themselves that. I don't have a monopoly on this term. But this particular group or swath of activists, these grassroots activists, are ones who try to stay outside of the strictures of some of these formal institutions, and who are committed, as they once put it to me, the thing that divides us from those yebosi, this Burmese term for the oil on top of the water, is that they were the ones with the people who are willing to fight and die for them. And those other people spent their time in a NGO conference room. So then what did they actually do? This group was quite ecumenical about its defense of the marginalized. So much like Don Juan once said, unfortunately, to be loyal to one paramour is to betray all the rest. These activists kind of felt the same way. To be loyal to one particular struggle would be to betray all the rest in a country that needs a lot of help. And so they were like a movable feast that I was lucky enough to partake in, going from rural struggles, mostly in Sagaing region, here in red, and Mandalay way, where much of the most intense revolutionary fighting is occurring today, to industrial zones around Yangon's periphery, where they mobilized for better worker treatment. And then they were based in peri-urban Yangon, mostly around here in Okalapa and Daundagon, where they were dealing with sort of like daily life struggles, where they would often chaperone claims that normal people could not make legible to institutions that were nominally but not functionally responsible for them. Okay, so how did an activist come to be? As activists, they embodied a social type that is quite legible in Myanmar. So the same way that your kids might be asked, what do you want to be when they grow up, and say a doctor or a baker or something. In Myanmar, you could say, I want to be an activist, and that's something that would kind of make sense because of these long-term lineages of activism and also the unfortunate need for activist work across generations. To become an activist, one almost always had to have gone to prison, to have to deal with the sort of existential crucible that was going to prison, where you get burned down to your essence, but that burning is also a weird refraction that could turn you into something else. Only after going through prison could your comrades trust you, that you have chosen the path of a struggler and really know what you're getting into. So the people who I work with who were not, hadn't gone through prison yet, it's not like they were sneered at, but you just couldn't know if we could trust you until you had done it. But because people had gone through this life in prison, they'd also kind of been thrown out of classic life cycles, so they weren't necessarily getting married, they weren't getting the skills to be a doctor or a baker, as I mentioned earlier. And so as a result, they emerged as kind of liminal subjects, not really still in the prison, but they often described how they still felt imprisoned, and how when they were in prison, they felt much freer than they did when they were on the outside, where particular political futures seemed foreclosed to them, especially after Aung San Suu Kyi took over and told the activists explicitly, there's no place for you in this future Burma but to vote for us. Go back and be a normal citizen. And they were quite crushed by this, because on one hand, they wanted the transition to succeed, but they didn't want it to go back to the military. But on the other hand, they didn't want it to succeed under those terms of sort of neoliberal class consolidation at the top and exclusion of peasants at the bottom. And ultimately, after giving it a chance for a number of years, they thought, okay, we have to go back to doing what we used to do, partially in part because that's what they knew best. But also politically, they wanted to reject this sort of empty liberalism. So how did they then reproduce themselves from one day to the next? And this is a question that took me a while to get up the courage to ask, because it's always a little dicey to kind of ask, well, so how are you funding all your day-to-day life? So they, on one hand, needed to forge these relationships with the people they defended, so the peasants and the workers, but to be a true struggler in Myanmar, to be a noble activist, to do it the right way, would be to reject accepting payment from the people who you supported, or otherwise you kind of devolve into this transactional relationship of a pueza, which is a Burmese term for broker and is quite derogated. On the other hand, it's very difficult to support yourself from patrons, because those patrons might be captured by a pretty corrupted political economy. So those people who could support them tend to get their money from pretty nasty stuff. So they're in this constant challenge of trying to fund themselves, to the point where I became a sort of pueza, where I helped connect them with one of these international NGOs that could support them. They got $20,000 for a year for their activities. They hated it so much of having to conform to those strictures, they gave up the money the next year. And I was like, gosh, it can't be that bad. But it's such a betrayal of the way they wanted to do activism and the spontaneity they needed to do it with, the sort of log frame mentality of having activities that needed to be fulfilled, that they said, you know what, we'll make it work our own way. So then, what kind of practices are we talking about? So they have to be willing to protest, to be arrested, to be beaten, to go to prison. But in so doing, to make sure they don't immediately get beaten, they don't immediately have to go to prison, they use their bodies in really creative ways to mark their sort of incursion into public space. And this is where I start comparing the sort of activist strategies that inhere here, versus the ones that inhere in some place like the West, where you can point to your status as an unmarked citizen, right? I am a citizen, I have rights, I pay my taxes, right? The sort of kind of tropes that we could draw on to demonstrate that we're just like everyone else. But in Myanmar, being just like everyone else is what would get you immediately hauled off to prison. And so instead, they talk about their exceptionality, the way that they're different from everyone else. And they do this through the comportment of their body, both the way that they perform their bodies, sort of very aggressively, but also incredibly serenely, if that makes sense. So it's sort of like aggressive occupation of space, and then a sort of unwillingness to be perturbed by threats by security apparatuses. So this sort of mixing of these two styles. And then using their body as a sort of palimpsest or a sort of a canvas on which the semiotic chains of their own previous activist work, in which those chains were sometimes literal prison chains, can be used to ground their incursions. So to put that a little bit less abstrusely, they would say, like, look at this scar, I got this when I was in prison, when you were still at your mother's breast. There's nothing you can do to me that hasn't already been done to me there. So consider if you really want this sort of contestation. Now, while that's pretty macho, and this is a quite masculinist study in a lot of ways, with parts where I tried to complicate that story, they also borrowed from a lot of other registers that effaced that sort of focus on masculinity, and showed how they were kind of willing to do anything and that was appropriate for the situation. This term, "achene ya mutide," it depends on the situation, was always coming up. And at first I thought it was kind of a way of, like, okay, that's what you say when you haven't done enough analysis, but it really meant that the protest situation was so imminent, like so emergent and so becoming, it was hard to know what you were going to do until you got there. So they would bargain, cajole, tease, and beg, and they would often use the esoteric realm to intimidate and shame. What's interesting here is that these activists are dressed up as spirits of the land who have come to judge the rightful owner of it. As such, it wasn't just a condemnation or a cursing, but it kind of produced a parallel justice system. The secular realm justice system would simply have given the land to the military cronies who stole it. But this is a different cosmology, a different version of justice, in which they said, sure, you can steal the land, but you might never be able to remove the curse. And in future lifetimes, you could end up having deeply damaged karma and huge consequences as a result. Whether or not one believes in those karmic outcomes, this is still a very shameful thing to endure, and often this was indexed by the fact that these kind of protest rituals were effective in the sense that crony families would back-channel connect with the activists and say, please stop doing this, my wife is concerned for my future lives, kind of thing. All right, so to sum up this part, activists must try to make the state legible, demanding a response, but even as they do so, they try to carve out enough space to kind of hail other publics to see things differently. One note here is just how much text is in many of these signboards in Burmese protests, because they're trying to explain to these publics why they've made this violation, not something that's very common, and how the people themselves could see things differently. One other funny little note here is that these are the blood spirit ogres who are supposed to come judge the rightful owners of the land, and I was like, where did you find these really like perfect images of the ogres from this Buddhist cosmology? And they said, oh, we just Googled ogre, and these were the scariest ogres we could find. So they were, they're pretty improvisational about what to use and what might work. Okay, so last section of the talk, in the next 10 minutes, I'm going to finish by talking about, okay, what kind of political idioms actually mobilize people. One time when I was talking to Goto, I asked him about, imagine that you're first engaging a village. What do you say to them the first time? He said, well, the first time I go to a new place and meet the villagers, I cannot say, you will have to protect your rights. If I talk that way, it will drive me off. Who is this guy, they will say. Now, at a certain level, this was a bit surprising to hear, the way that Burma had been so incorporated into the global human rights regime, at least symbolically. So here we have rock star Bono, who wrote a song about Aung San Suu Kyi, and you cutouts of her face at one of the concerts. And she quite willingly accepted this until she quite shamefully rejected it. On the other hand, this was a dominant trope because of many of the exiles when they fled to this back in 1988, when they fled to the border to get away from the military during one of its earlier coups, articulated a discourse that was very much foregrounded human rights. So people would say, we are working for the human rights of all Burmese people. Our organization tells people in Burma they have human rights. And I wasn't even asking about rights, so I was quite surprised to hear this. Inside Burma, where I had lived, people would talk about working for the revolution, for the daily lives of the people. Now, why such a difference I was initially interested in? Why so much talk about human rights outside of Burma and so little in the place where the abuses were occurring? Now, on one hand, this is a pretty obvious, there's an obvious answer to this. Going back to Jim Scott and the idea of the public transcript versus the hidden transcript, people on the inside might believe in human rights, but might not want to articulate them because they'll get bumped in the head. On the border, they have freedom to describe things as they actually see conditions, and so we'll describe things in human rights terms. Done, right? But I spent enough time doing ethnography with the people on the border that I listened to the weird ways that they described human rights as having like deep consequences for how they understood themselves. So people saying things like, I didn't feel like a full person, a real person until I learned about human rights. Or I wasn't able to connect with other Burmese people but through human rights. You're Kachin and I'm Burma, but we have human rights to cohere us. So it felt like they was doing a lot of work, and to the point where people didn't even use it instrumentally. They were committed and said things like, we need to teach all the Burmese people about human rights. We need to translate the UDHR into Burmese, sneak those copies back into the country. I know this because I was asked to do this on one occasion, and I kind of demurred. And then spread them through thousands of villages so that everyone starts to learn about these things. So it seemed like two sort of different cultures were developing, one of which had more access to the international domain and hence absorbed many of its sort of symbolic presuppositions, and also tended to monopolize the ability to speak for Burma, as it were. Inside the country, a place that wasn't as easily seen, it seems like different conversations were occurring. And this occurred, or a fine point was put on this when, a long time ago, before I was even really doing this research, when someone said something really weird about human rights itself that stuck with me. She said, because I was like asking her about these questions, she was the head of an NGO in Burma, a Burmese woman, and she said, well, you have to understand something about our language. She says, we don't really have rights. If you're invited to go to a training or something, you will use a kwenye. You will say you have a right to go to the training. I think in the West, you would say opportunity, no? But this is because the separate Western concept of right does not exist in our culture. It has been used a lot in exile groups. Darn it. So people have heard it, but the people don't have the concept. So the average person sees human rights as a political word. They don't want to really study about it. So at this point, like, I'm a graduate student who's learned about the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis and the linguistic relativity theory. Does anyone know that one? Basically, it's like, and granted, Sapir-Whorf actually never articulated it, but it's a thing in anthropology of a certain kind at a certain moment that said, and it's actually kind of cool at a certain level, and it brings a lot of people to linguistic anthropology, because it says that the kind of language you have will predict the kind of thought that your culture has. The kind of culture you have will predict the kind of thought that you have. So like Eskimos have a bunch of words for snow because snow is really relevant for them, and as a result, they come up with a bunch of words for it. So this is cool because it makes people think, and it interpolates a number of graduate students because they're like, oh, I'm living in a slightly different world, ontologically speaking, because I have different words to describe that world. But on the other hand, it can be really dangerous too, because it leads to linguistic racism of the form, well, you guys don't have the word for democracy, you don't have the word for rights, hence you're not well sophisticated enough and evolved enough to even deserve those concepts, so we're going to colonize you. And people used this during 19th century European racism. So knowing that history, I was a little bit, I wanted to be sensitive to immediately taking this and running with it. But at the same time, it was a provocation to kind of ask myself, what would it mean that these concepts that we keep held apart in English and in the associated, political ontology associated with English, rights and opportunities, are never so separated in Burmese? What would it mean for a right and opportunity to be the same? So this is a question I kind of like started to ask or entertain as I developed a corpus, which is like you start to listen to how people talk about rights and start to try to make sense of what's going on. So I started to look at Burmese rights, or rights in Burmese language, and akwinye is indeed translated as rights or opportunities, depending on the context. So cognates such as akwinye suffixing human, like lu akwinye, or worker, alotama akwinye, mean, for better, basically, they mean like human rights or worker rights. But if akwinye is prefixed to opportunist, akwinye tama, it becomes, the affix tama, it becomes opportunist. So the terms definitely point in two different directions. So I thought this is kind of interesting, and it made me ask what exactly is a right. Now these are notoriously difficult to define, especially because rights tend to be used unreflectively, as I had been using them. I was interested in the human rights thing, but I wasn't so interested in the rights itself, because I didn't know that there could be a plural understanding of rights until I started to look, and again, through a kind of corpus analysis, all the ways that we talk about rights in English are also quite weird. They can mean aspirations. It would be right or a right that. It can be a moral demand. It's right because it should be. It could be a just dessert, although I spelled desserts there wrong. It's not a delicious thing after dinner, but something that's earned through some sort of labor. And then, of course, the most obvious, the quasi-legal statutes. It's right because the law says so. Also note here, staying with the linguistics, that not all languages have a slippage between noun and adjective, right? A noun, a right, versus right, adjective, it is right that. Burmese doesn't, for instance. So I started to think, well, it's quite possible that these things have different configurative rapport, as Worf once put it, that they collocate and communicate with other words around them to create different sort of understandings of the world than ones that I have in my language. And so actually turning the sort of racism of Sapir-Whorf on its head and going back to where linguistic anthropology should be, it's like worthwhile seeing how people talk about these things in their broader context. So staying with the English part, I spent some time reading the philosophy of rights, and this philosopher at Cambridge named Raymond Goyce is kind of interested in how they structure demands. And he says rights are rights because they act as trumps over other political imperatives. They act as a firewall or a bulwark against certain kinds of politics to sever the possibility of doing certain things, even if a bunch of people decide that that's the right way of doing stuff. So we might think it'd be good if we appropriate all of Elon Musk's money and throw him in the pit of despair somewhere. But a rights paradigm would say, no, you can't really do that, he has rights, and so it would sever the politics. It would say we can't actually do that. So Goyce thinks this is not just bad, but also rarely actually describes how rights work in progress, but Dworkin and others in the liberal tradition think it's good, and so this person wrote this book, Taking Rights Seriously, which is all to set up one of my favorite jokes of the book, that in Burma you don't have taking rights seriously, you have taking rights, and doing it so quite seriously. And in Burma things seem quite different, and so how so? Go back to the cartoons in which someone is taking rights quite seriously. You have a man on the right, saying, I'm not the kind of person who takes everything, and he has a bag here of akwinye. He's leaving a bag of duties, and he says, I've left something for you. So the distinction I want to draw here, linguistically, is that rights are not understood as they are in the liberal tradition of Dworkin as inalienable possessions. Instead, when rights are lost, they do not talk about them as they would kin or body parts as still theirs. I want to linger on this because I think it's a really cool insight that linguistic anthropologists have made about inalienable possessions. So if I, on the way to this talk, I sever my arm and it's left on the pavement out there, I still use a personal pronoun mine to describe it, even though it's not really mine in some sort of sense. It doesn't really, someone could run off with it, right? They could have my arm. And my mother, she's fine, lovely person, she could perish and she would still be my mother in a way, even though in some senses she's not. And so what's cool or weird about an alienable possession, according to Paul Kokelman, are these are the things that we presuppose that humans have, and they're constantly discussed because they're so important. So going back to my arm, or a head, the person who had an arm sounds strange because we presuppose that people have arms. So we just get on with it, and we just talk about the status of the arm. Now, arms are pretty important, so we talk about them a lot, so they become recursively embedded in our sense of personhood. You might see where I'm going here. Let's apply this to rights. Saying the woman who had rights sounds a bit strange to us, right? Because we presuppose that she has these rights already, even if she's not able to access them. But the woman who was fighting for her rights that she didn't have sounds fine to us, even though it's kind of a weird thing. So unless you're not convinced, consider those poets of the 1990s, the Beastie Boys, who remind us that you have to fight for your right to party, right? It's your right to party even before you have it, even when you're fighting for it, even when your fighting might not allow you to reattain it, that's still your right to party. And I think this is kind of weird, but we don't think of it as weird, it's even weirder. And so I wanted to kind of like compare these two different ways of thinking about rights. So I started spending a lot of time looking at the strange relationship of possession that's presupposed even by philosophers who maybe should know better, talking about the rights that they don't have until they try to perform them into existence. So here's Judith Butler doing this, talking about their rights that they don't have until they're created. Here's Jacques Rancière, who's clearly surprised at my critique, who talks about all these rights that are had before they're actually had. Now, I don't want to be too hard on these philosophers, not the least because they're very, very smart, because they're highlighting something cool about what J.L. Austin and Peirce talked about as, well, Austin explicitly talked about as a performative, a kind of speech act that produces what it presupposes in the act of describing it, which is more complicated than it needs to be. Think about like a pastor who's pronouncing husband and wife at a marriage. The speech act is not descriptive. It's not describing what is happening. It's performative. It's creating what is happening in the very enunciation, right? It says the words, and then those words create something that wasn't there before. Really cool. Another thing that, as a graduate student, I thrilled to. And it does sometimes work. So Rancière is basically saying that because human rights act as a sort of inscription in the symbolic, they become a resource for people who are excluded to grasp onto them and to use them in creative ways and to perform themselves into existence of a set that they had been previously excluded from. But I want to stress that if a performative can work one way, it can also work the opposite way. If you can gain rights, you can also lose them, as we saw in the tragic Dobbs case of the last, what was that, I guess a year and a half ago, the way that we lost something that was ours for a long time, I think creates a certain kind of psychic and existential ennui. I'll come back to that because of the way it's tied up with these inalienable possessions. In Burma, however, because relations between average Burmese and governance apparatuses have never stabilized into contractual forms describing standards of care to which subalterns have legible and predictable entitlements, a long but I think specific technical way of describing what a right is, rights remain alienable possessions. They can be carried off, they can be stolen, they can be loot, they can be snatched, just as in that cartoon. One person can get more rights than another person. They're quantified in a particular way. Whereas in I think the Anglo-American tradition, we think of rights as public goods, as things that are non-rival and non-excludable, like national defense or clean air. You're getting access to it doesn't impact mine, and you can't be denied clean air while I get it. And rights are kind of similar, right? Everyone enters into the set and is able to perform their rights without really impacting others. At least that's the conceit, and right-wing anti-immigrant discourses are actually bringing up the fact that rights are maybe more zero-sum than we let on. In Burma, it's much more like this, the zero-sum approach, where Burmese would say, or one person once said to me, in my view, we usually consider that if you get your rights, I will lose mine, or I win and you lose. As a result, they're only adequate to those who perform them adequately. They only emerge if there's an opportunity for their realization. And that allows us to return to this idea of rights and opportunities, seeing how they could be blended into one term rather than kept apart. Finally, I think it's really cool how rights can get re-signified as a result of their interaction with a particular material political situation. And as a spectrum, if rights can mean as much, equity can mean as much as a right and as little as an opportunity, how people actually understand that term is subject to their experience with the world. So this, one of my favorite cartoons, demonstrates this processually, much as we understand the world in our lives. So this teacher is trying to teach human rights, and she says, let's say it 3 times. Every person has the right to security from harm. And then she says, the bullets are coming, crouch under the bench as gunshots ring out, and the children all crouch under the bench. Now she tries to go back to the previous situation, right, the textbook definition of human rights. Okay, say it again 3 times. And the students, updating their priors in a wonderfully Bayesian way that I think subalterns often have to be because they don't have the luxury to be otherwise, have updated their understanding of the world. And so they say, crouch under the bench, crouch under the bench. So if you are told you have rights, but those rights are not realized or enjoyed, how many times or in what kind of ways must that performative, you have rights, fail before you see that failure not as an exception or a mistake, but as a reflection of reality itself? To put this in more poetic terms, how much time must a rule be broken before it breaks forever, breaks in ways it can't be put back together? Okay, so this allows me to return to this block quote and give it a little bit more context. As a result, rights can be refused, and this is where the title comes back in 2 ways. Rights as substantive entitlements are certainly denied by the state to Burmese people. That's a sort of obvious reading. But then the secondary reading is that Burmese people also refuse rights as an idiom for structuring their claims. So activists reject them as potentially undermining their projects. Recall how Gotol is concerned that people would chase him off. And if we return to the distinction between resistance and refusal, rights are a sort of deontic modality, demanding how things should be, like framing this contestation one-to-one, which might be a little bit dangerous in this context and might not actually result in victory. Marginalized people refuse them as a false promise that exposes them to risk, and hence might not want to endorse them. At one point, activists who had spent most of their time in Geneva and at the UN and such returned to Burma to try to mobilize support for reforming a certain law that was excluding Myanmar Muslims and Rohingya. And someone said back to that person, if a beggar child demands something, you won't give it. But if he's cowering in the corner, you take pity on him. We are the most discriminated against minority in the country. We can't afford to be so aggressive about demanding things as rights. So where does this leave rights then? Are they completely unuseful? My hypothesis is that Acquitté does not contain that sort of trump against power. It's closest to a counterclaim made in the always aspirational sense, only made possible by the opportunity to be realized. And so the activist political task then is a much more structural one in which they work to try to change the conditions of possibility to allow someone to have the opportunities to have rights or the opportunities to have opportunities, which might, come to think of it, might be a sort of play on Hannah Arendt's idea of the right to have rights. Here, this is the opportunity to have opportunities. Okay, so I've gone on for 50 minutes. I'll take just 5 more minutes to do a wrap up, is that okay? So, and I'll skip part of this conclusion to focus on the rights parts. So for those who in the West who think they have rights, is it perhaps more like Myanmar as we might think? Not linguistically, of course, but in terms of the actual affordances of this term, the things that we can actually achieve. And I'm going to do the anthro thing, which is to take a place that seems really strange and try to make it seem more normal, take the place here that we think is normal and try to make it strange, and put those 2 things together. Oops. All right, so what then is so wrong about rights? So here, Kostas Desinas talks about an inflation of rights, the way that things, just because they're articulated as rights in discourse, come to be seen as rights even before they're realized. And he calls this an inflation of rights talk. And I would argue this makes sense when read through my deconstruction of the linguistic aspects of claiming rights, because once they're claimed, they start to attach themselves to our personhood in ways that when we lose them, it becomes quite assaulting. Because we can't entertain things going the opposite direction. What happens when the claimed right is not delivered? When the protester is beaten, the coal plant gets built despite local opposition. So there's an inflation of discussion of rights, but we don't always get them, and that creates an interesting situation, especially given this other force that we're subjected to, particularly by class, race, and gender, of this biopolitical abdication and political economic erosion of our ability to realize the rights that we also have, something that Gilmore calls organized abandonment. The transition for white men, from Fordism and welfarism in the 1950s to what are called flexible regimes of accumulation and outsourcing and short timing that define today, fewer people can meaningfully participate in the market, and they're called losers as a result. While America's brand of neoliberalism diverges from Burma's, America's is increasingly defined by this abandonment, such that non-producers are symbolically and socially devalorized. So if we put these two things together, we have this interesting machine of symbolic inclusion and material expulsion or extrusion. And I want to argue that failure to realize rights in practice that are guaranteed in discourse results in a splitting of the person into two. The ideal rights-bearing self, on one hand, and the degraded version waiting or trying to be restored to the latter. And I think this has serious ramifications. It can be really demobilizing at the level of tactics as people fight for rights that they think they have but don't, tied up in this sort of rights-based paradigm, focusing on getting back their rights rather than focusing on other versions of justice, perhaps. And when they don't get their rights, they're left with few other recourses. They go home and write an angry Facebook post about how they didn't get their rights. Now, granted, that calls attention to maybe a form of imminent critique that highlights the difference between what is guaranteed de jure and what is realized in practice. But how many times, going back to my little semiotic trick, how many times can you call attention to the non-delivery of the thing that you supposedly have before that just becomes sad on your part, rather than potentially emancipatory, potentially revelatory of a truly gap in the way that things should be? Okay, so to wrap up, I promise, final lessons from activists in the coup context. So Burmese, conversely, are, I think, kind of impervious to the rights trap. Now granted, on the one hand, this might be demobilizing. There's nothing to secure action, so you can't rely on anything, so the barrier to entry is pretty high. But on the other hand, the fact that it's impossible to know how things will end, the fact that there isn't a rights regime that you need to rely on, provides opportunities for lots of improvisation. So at every iterative stage, apparent victories might have suddenly sundered, but potential losses are just opportunities for other improvisations. So going back to San, she yelling victory has been achieved is just an interesting way of extending the temporality of the activist encounter into the potential ever-unfolding future. And while this is a little bit self-serving, I want to argue that actions that she and others did during 2014 and 15, when I was studying them, seeded the sort of field for repertoires of contention that were picked up during the anti-coup revolution. And the Chainsaw Daipoi, the huge number of them that were on the streets and in the paddy fields during the 2021 revolution, I think were derived from all the stuff that was going on when I studied things. So I kind of see activists as guides to alternative futures. So they do not, of course, immediately enact new and inevitable futures, right? That critique of the performative I had earlier. Instead, their bodies and words initiate a potential trajectory, one that haunts the existing one and threatens to return later as a sort of ghost to rearrange things. So activists lay down different pathways that people could potentially take, and that's at least what gives me hope for the country today as they continue to fight this revolution. All right, thank you.